that you have this conditioning in your consciousness, and that's determining your whole experience. We can say even more so than the circumstances in your environment. Even more so. We're conditioned by advertising and consumer society to think, oh, if we have these different products, or we get to pay and receive certain services, or we can pay to experience certain types of entertainment or, special experiences, then we'll be happy. But actually, happiness or any type of peace is really not coming from the things around us in our environment or the different services, products, experiences that we have. It's produced by our own mental attitude towards that and the conditioning that we have. And we can even experience this for ourselves. Like, suppose you have a desire, you want to go out for, let's say you want to go have a cup of tea at a, Cafe Nero or something like that, okay? And you're going to meet your friends, and you all love to watch such and such episode of such and such program on TV. So now you're all going to have a cup of tea and you're going to talk all about this program.
This is all too close to home.
Okay? So you're really looking forward to this. Oh, this is going to be great, It was such a great episode, and you have all your opinions and all your reactions to everything that happened, and you're ready to express them with much emotion and impress your friends with your comments and your analysis, And you've got it all triggered, and you come and you're ready to have your chat and your tea, And then, you know what? You do. And you have your tea, and you make your points, and you laugh, and everyone is delighted, right? And then, you have a nice go with it for a good 45 minutes or whatever about this. And then you're off, and you're ready to go do whatever you have to go to school or go to work or go wherever you have to go. Now suppose, you're leaving the cafe, and then the people at the cafe say, sorry, you can't leave. And you say, why not? And they say, well, we saw you all having this chat, and it looked so wonderful. We think this is why we make our cafe. So people can come and have such lovely chats with such lovely tea here in this place. And it was so pleasing to us to see you having such a lovely chat. We just want to observe you continuing this lovely chat on and on and on. So please, all of you sit back down and continue. I mean, this is a little strange example, but just go with it. So suppose that happens, right? And say, okay, keep talking about the TV program. Keep having your tea, right? Then now what are you going to do, right? It's already like you already chewed the whole thing, right? So if you start saying, oh, well, I remember at the beginning, it's like, well, we already talked about that. And, we already talked about that. Oh, we already said that, And all of a sudden, that thing that you were just like, all of a sudden it's like very dry and boring. And you've already gone through the whole thing. And then you're like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. What am I doing here? And I've got things to do, and I want to do something else. And the very same experience, all the exact same factors involved, it just went from delightful to like really annoying. Right? And the only difference is your attitude towards it. See, otherwise it's exactly the same. So something like this, we can understand that our attitude towards something, and whether we desire it or not at that time, and whether it suits our present mental state, is really what determines whether we're happy or not the thing itself. So anyhow, this is just and it's maybe a little too much time on the example to understand the immediacy of this conditioning that we carry within our mind. So the whole basis of the Gita is to come along and say, this is your problem, and here's how you can deal with it. By engaging in what is taught here, you can get out of this conditioned state where you constantly have a tendency to be attached to the mentality you have, the desires you have along with it, the expectations, the sense of entitlement that you have with that, and thus all the frustration and unhappiness that you experience in your life. So then the main point of advice is given with this verse. Karmanyevadi karaste ma phaleshu karachana ma karma phala heturbur mate sangusta karmani. Where Krishna says, the only thing you're entitled to do is act. You're not entitled to the results of your action. And you shouldn't give up acting, nor should you expect to get the particular results that you expect from acting. And what this does is it puts you into a mode of being that puts you in direct opposition to the contamination in your consciousness, or to this conditioning towards an egoistic way of life. It puts you right in opposition to that. And then when you try to live by it, you realize how riveted, how attached you are, how conditioned you are by this false sense of self and all the attachment that you have to it. And for some people, if they even hear the insinuation that one would live like this, they don't want to hear it, they're like, ugh. Right? It can't even go inside. Right? Then others, they might hear it, but they think, yeah, right, like anyone could ever live like that. It's like a laughable matter to them. Then there's some people who are kind of like, whoa, that's deep, man. That's like, I never even thought about that. But they don't actually want to try. And then so many layers, to the point where some people are actually willing to like, wow, I could actually try that. And then there's the people who try it and go, nah, that's way too hard. No, thank you. Then there's people who try it, find it really hard, and think, well, maybe I should at least keep trying a little bit. And then there's, to the point where someone's like, if I don't do this, even though it's so hard, I really don't see any other worthwhile prospect in my life. And how is that? Right? Then we can remember the premise of the Gita. The Gita is spoken at a moment of extreme urgency, where there is, an extreme difficulty being confronted. So we can say, if someone can come to perceive the urgency and immediacy of these teachings in their life, as Arjuna did, then they will get on with it. They'll feel the necessity of practicing these things. And then they may take up this, which is what we're describing now as Nishkam Karma Yoga. And to achieve Gyan, to achieve Dhyan, and in general to achieve anything else given in the Gita, this is considered the prerequisite, or the first step in the process, by the conventional analysis. Cleansing, yes. This, in other words, until and unless all this egotistical attachment is dissolved, there's no talk of peace, joy, spiritual, higher things. It's not going to happen. Nothing else to say. Excuse me?
Upsetting.
No, it's not upsetting. It's relieving to get it. Right?
Right.
Yes.
Then what is the motivation? If we shouldn't expect a result.
Yeah.
Then what? Normally in this world, every action we do, our motivation is we'll get a result.
Right.
Then how do we get the motivation?
Good, very good question. So, what this introduces actually into our life is another cause for action. Because just as you're saying, a person carrying this, what they call, ahangta and mamata, or makar and mamakar, this sense of self and mine, then their automatic tendency is to try to pursue that. So we have to go deep and think, what is the motivation for action itself? Any action. Where does it come from? Right? Then that goes a little bit outside the scope of what's directly in the Gita, but from general scripture, we understand that the jiva, by nature, is said to have ananda within it. But a very minute amount, a very, very minute amount of happiness or positive existence is inherent in the jiva. And it is said that when the jiva is conditioned, it feels not that ananda, but the lack of that ananda. And it has this sense of in itself that it's meant for this thing that it doesn't have. It's there, but yet that thing that's within them is interrupted or covered over in such a way. So the jiva has this constant sense of trying to feel this thing that seems so immediate and inherent within it, but yet is not entirely experienced. And that's the inherent condition of the conditioned soul. So it's explained that what everyone does is a pursuit of that feeling, is a pursuit of that thing within its own nature. And that therefore, the way it's analyzed in the Upanishads and also in Bhagavatam, is that everything that's considered dear, desirable, good, etc., is dear because it is conducive to that thing which is most truly dear or sought, that state, that feeling within the self. So the way that that's put bluntly, I think it's in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad or the Chandogya Upanishad, one of them has an extensive analysis of this, where it says, the mother, the father, the spouse, the child, the friend, none of them are truly dear. They are all dear because the self is dear.
It's a little bit selfish.
Well, it's selfish, but it's also something you could say outside the scope of what we would define as selfish in the negative sense. We're talking about something that's simply the innate function of an entity. Like it's its actual nature. So it's not something that we can cast a fault upon. But when that auto tendency to feel that thing within it that it can't get at is covered by Maya, then it's constantly trying to get that in this world based on this misconceived identity. And so, like elsewhere in Gita, Arjuna says, why do I commit these wrong actions as if by force? Like I don't want to do wrong, but I still do. It's like there's this force driving me to do selfish activity when I don't even want to. Or literally it says sin. Why do people sin even when they don't want to? And then Krishna says that the cause of all sin that people do, whether they like it or not, is kama. Which you may, in this context, we say selfish desire or desire. And that is like, almost like an addiction that they have. That's just driving them to act. And Krishna doesn't talk lightly about this. He talks very heavily about this. He says that this experience of kama, it is like dealing with a fire. And when you're dealing with a fire, what are you dealing with? Something that is extremely dangerous and completely insatiable. So, in classical analysis of negotiations, then there is what's called these principles of sama, dan, bhed, and danda, which is said to be how you negotiate with an enemy or another in order to produce a negotiation or an agreement or a desirable truce or arrangement between you two. So these are also used in like warfare between nations. So first thing you do, you try to pacify the other person by just talking about what's happening. You just talk to them and you try to pacify, what's happening? Oh, this, and sometimes it's just a matter of miscommunication. But if you realize, no, we're actually having a conflict of interest. Then the second step, if you can't just do it by just with words and then the second step is offer them something. You can say bribe them or make a deal with them, give them something that fulfills their interest, and then they won't oppose you. That's called dan. But if it's such a difficult situation that they won't even accept an offering, in other words, they have such a conflict of interest from you that you can't give them something. In other words, they want to take the position that you're in, or they want to remove you from this situation in some way. Then you take the next protocol is is bhed. which literally means difference. In other words, you either change their mind by convincing them that what they want to do is not what they should do, or you create a division amongst them where they no longer agree that that's what they should do against you. And there's so many more things about this in political science and all that. It's outside the scope of our talk. But if even that doesn't work, if even trying to change something about their present mentality and position doesn't work, then the last thing is danda, means the stick. In other words, fighting, force, power. There's no other means of resolving the issue. So that's the last protocol. And a worst case scenario is the physical fight, or if you're dealing with someone, is the physical punishment, or this type of thing. So Dandavat is first. If Dandavat doesn't work, then Danda. So Krishna, in the commentaries on Gita given by, I forget if it's Baladev or Chakravarti Thakur, he shows how what Krishna says to Arjuna in the Gita is based on these principles. And the ways that he refers to kama hint at the fact that sama doesn't work, dana doesn't work, bhed doesn't work. The only way to deal with this thing is danda. In other words, this thing is a mortal enemy that cannot be in any way pacified. And it's compared to a fire. Means you put a log on the fire, is the fire happy? Is the fire going to stop? Nah, it's going to keep going stronger. If you give it 100 pieces of wood, keeps burning more. You give it 1,000 pieces of wood, keeps burning more. It doesn't stop. It's not going to stop. No matter what you give it, you can't pacify it. That only makes it stronger. So he says, material desire, kama, is like that. It's your mortal enemy. It's the enemy of the wise. The only enemy, actually, of every entity. Not any other person is actually an enemy. This is the enemy. And this enemy is fearsome. So he says, there's nothing you can do. You have an extremely formidable enemy and you have to kill it. This is how the third chapter ends. Right? And then he prescribes, you have to first realize, indriyani paranyuhur indriya, beyond the senses, the mind, the intellect is you, the soul. You're not the thing. You don't identify with this desire. Now here's the interesting part that we're getting on. Is so where does this desire come from? Right? Why is it so powerful? Because it's the inversion or the influence, it's the soul's own nature expressed in a reflection under Maya itself. Like, dig that. Like, the soul is automatically seeking this unexperienced state of ananda within itself. That's what it's doing. It can't not do that. That's not an opinion, that's not an ethnic thing, a cultural thing, a historical thing. That's an ontological thing about the nature of any jiva within time and space. And then under the influence of Maya, that thing inverts into kama. Or in other words, the application or the pursuit of that based on a false identity and some interest within the plane of that identity. And you cannot stop that thing because it's coming out of you yourself. It's like your own nature reflecting back into this thing that causes you to hurt yourself. That's.
If it's so innate, how do we call it truly an enemy then? If you know what I mean? It's like it's
well, but it's an enemy in the sense that it's part of the influence of Maya over us. It's not in there. It's not innate in us. It's the way that our innate and self's energy gets channeled when we're under the influence of Maya, and it's coming back on us. So it's an enemy in the sense that if we act on it, that will perpetuate our suffering indefinitely. It's contrary to our real interest. But, okay, so the main point we're getting to is about motivation. You know, if this saying is act without attachment to the result, you say, well, why would I do that? And we're so heavily conditioned to try to find some type of ananda And we're doing that based on this false identity we've acquired. So then, how is it that we would have the motivation or the seriousness of motivation to act differently than this? This is the question. So now we have the points in play to give the answer. And the point is that the whole of Vedic Shastra introduces what is called, literally, vidhi, or in other words, an imperative or an injunction, something that is to be done or ought to be done. You know, and it brings that into your life. And it says, don't adhere to this selfish tendency, this influence of kama, adhere to this other thing that ought to be done. And in one sense, it's that simple. It's like, what is Shastra? It's just this thing that comes along and says, obey. I mean, sorry. Basically, that's what it is. You know? But it's conceived that the reason one should obey that, and the reason that one is coming to say that, is that it has your highest interest behind it. Your best interest is represented here. So initially, and at the stage of karma yoga, the motivation that is drawn upon for this adherence is what Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls kartabhya buddhi. Or in other words, simply this sense that it ought to be done. Like, why? It should. It leads to benefit. It ought to be done. How and what and why, maybe it doesn't even need to be spelled out entirely. But this is like a whole layer of human experience. And a vast amount of Shastra is dealing with things just on this level. Now, of course, you're like, well, what about Bhakti? You know, exactly. Bhakti is another layer above that, which is what makes it so beautiful and so meaningful and so tasteful, is it's a whole other layer of motivation that's neither selfish nor simply like a generic. It's something that is both innately beneficial and innately tasteful. So classically the Shastra, it gives this analysis of Shreya and Preya. Doing what is pleasing to you or doing what is good for you. And it puts these things in direct opposition and says, what are you going to do? You know, this, I think it's the Katha Upanishad has this main narrative about that. So then people get this strong sense of, we have to do what's ultimately good, not what's fundamentally pleasing. But then what the Aracharjas have argued is the position of bhakti is such a great thing because it's something that unites, again, Shreya and Preya. In other words, it's the ultimate Shreya, mainly, and it's also so beautiful. It's also so pleasing to do. Therefore, it's the ultimate, most beautiful thing. But at this stage, that hasn't been introduced at the point that we're talking about. And the idea is the motivation is simply, you know, Arjuna has surrendered to Krishna as his guru. And his guru is saying, do this. And this will purify you and this will end your suffering. So simply that. Simply this confidence that some higher fundamental benefit is coming for me from this.
That's where I wanted to go to then. So ultimately you're not doing it without expecting any result because you're doing it because it's in your higher interest. So you're still expecting something, aren't you?
Yes.
That's my doubt. Like I just find it too hard to understand how you can act without expecting anything at all. It's just, you're still expecting something. You're acting because they're telling you, or the Vedas say, your guru says, this is your higher interest, so you should do it because of this. And then you're doing it because you expect, or you're doing it because it's your higher interest. That's my doubt.
It's the karma phala, the fruit of the action that you're not motivated by. You know? The actual activity.
Okay. Yeah.
I think to act without, what's wrong with self-interest?
Because if you're inherently you're inherently seeking for ananda, then you can't ever not seek ananda.
Right.
That's what I mean, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, it's a sense of this is fundamentally what ought to be. But you can say it's also introducing a sense of responsibility into a whole greater than myself. Right? That this is coming from a guru, this is coming from Shastra, this is coming from Bhagavad, this is coming from something that's integrated into the whole, not just like my individual interest at the ignoring the rest. So this is something that's fundamentally good, and it's not only fundamentally good for me, it's fundamentally good for all. But also, Prabhu makes a very good point that we should act without attachment to the result. But we're at that point, we're still attached to acting without attachment. There's still some inherent focus and intent within that, and that's not a fault, because of the point we made before. That's actually, there's this inherent thing in our nature. So the main thing is that if we enter into that spirit of thought and action in our life, that I'm doing this because it ought to be done, I'm doing this because it is of inherent good for all at the expense of none. And how exactly will that affect me in the immediate or here or there along the way? That's not my concern. In other words, whatever immediate reaction or fruit may come to me or not come to me along the way, that's not going to deter my adherence to this ideal or to this higher imperative. And that attitude of acting and having it not be dictated by these immediate effects that we get, that's the purifying element. Or that's the thing that starts cutting away at all the conditioning in the mind.
It's all doing good for the sake of good, like the phrase, like that. Good for goodness sake, they say. Yeah.
So that way of life is purifying. And as you all know, if you try it, it's also extremely peaceful. It gives you so much peace when you're detached from so many minor outcomes of things along the way. How much stress, how much anxiety, how much frustration is just immediately dissolved by this. It's amazing. It's extremely practical. Extremely practical. Right? And refreshing to realize that so many things that I'm so much riding on, I can be completely okay without doing that. Whoa! It's extremely practical and beneficial in our life.
It can also be misapplied sometimes, you think. In certain contexts, it's an excuse for apathy or it brings to mind, I was talking with Sripad Maharaj the other night about when Narotam and Srinivas and Shyamananda are going from Braj to Bengal, and then all the books get stolen with all the Goswami's books, and this is the one copy that is in existence in the sense of all the books, and they get stolen, and they're saying, Ma Palishu Kadachana, not to, in a sense to be, but in that moment it would have been completely the wrong thing to do, actually, that attitude.
Well, I think it's also a matter of application. If you think about that, what did Srinivas do? He said, I have to just look for the books now.
Well, but they were deeply upset too. They were very disturbed as well.
Right.
Deeply disturbed because they've lost their guru's books.
Right, but that upsetness is inherent in their acceptance of the circumstance and their attempt to fulfill it. We're not attached to it, means we'll just give up now. They didn't just give up, they kept doing it. And they felt these emotions on the basis of being completely adherent to their duty, whatever the difficulty may come.
But there, the result to find the books being vitally important. If we had lost those books, that's a huge tragedy and we would all be devastated. and we want to find these books. So actually there, phala, very important. You better find those books.
But I guess the result was actually to preach or to distribute those books.
Yeah.
That was the main fruit they were seeking. So that them losing those books was an obstacle to their real goal, isn't it?
No.
So they became upset because they weren't able to attain the real.
Yeah, I'm just saying in some situations, result is important in some sense. It's like to be attached to the result, and to ensure that the result is good is not a bad thing to be striving for.
But I mean, to me, you could still hold that in that situation, they're just adhering to their duty all the way. The duty is to produce the result.
Exactly that. I think that to be attached to the result at that higher level, that attachment is not karma. That's another thing. It's it's like this is beyond.
So they're not attached to it because of their personal interest, but because of their guru's order.
Right. I mean, they're trying to do their duty or their service, and they're experiencing these emotions on the basis of seeking to do that. And they're, like in the case of Srinath, he's not at all flinching from continuing to fulfill the duty. And he's concerned with the result because that's his duty.
But would you say it's his duty, or is that their duty? I mean, it's his seva. Is seva duty, or is that's another?
Okay, now I mean that.
Sorry. Yeah.
I mean,
sorry.
seva is more than duty. Anyway. But if we want to talk then about bhaktas, then we have this phrase, Krishna bhakta nishkam atev shanta, bhukti mukti siddhikami sakali ashanta. That the bhaktas are nishkam because, they're peaceful because they have no kama. Right? But yet we see that they experience all these things on the basis of seva. So then what is the basis of that? The basis of becoming completely free from kama, then that's only a partial transition. Leaving kama completely, entering into bhakti, one's only interest becomes the satisfaction of Krishna or prema. Admendriya priti bancha. Kama is the pleasure for oneself, prema is desire for the pleasure of Krishna. So then if they're experiencing or they're attached to results, so to speak, in the interest of pleasing Krishna, that's already on the plane of being completely detached from any self-interest or concern for oneself. So therefore that we see devotees are, upset that they didn't fulfill their service or something like that. That's free from, or in the proper sense, it's free from being attached to the result. It's rather an expression of being attached to Krishna and wanting to please Him. However, in the sadhana stage, in many cases it ends up being a mixture of the two. Where yes, we're unhappy that this isn't pleasing Krishna, but also we're getting this ego prick of I didn't do the thing that I wanted to do and I'm not, succeeding as I wanted to succeed, or there's this mixed stage. So then the process of going through all of this purifies that and brings us to that point where really we have readiness for all outcomes in our own self, but yet full attention that the best possible outcome is there in the offering to Krishna. Okay, wow, we're having trouble getting onto our slokas here. But anyway, we're on this track that, the experience we have of the contamination in our mind, or this so-called contamination in your consciousness. What is that? It's not some hobo-jobo talk, not some strange thing. It's this extremely immediate experience that we have moment to moment in our life of attachment to circumstances and this acquired identity that we have riding on their outcomes. And the Bhagavad Gita is coming in an extremely practical way to say, here's how you can clean that from yourself and you'll get so much relief. And then if we take up that process, this Nishkam Karma Yoga, that will make one qualified for meditation or for study of Shastra or all the other practices that are prescribed in Gita or elsewhere. That's the prerequisite, that's entrance. If you have contaminated consciousness, you can study all you want, you can meditate all you want, it's not going to work. You have to go through this process of purification, there's no other way. This is like the fundamental level of Gita. But Bhakti is the one exception to this, because Bhakti contains within it also the power of producing Chitta Shuddhi. And it can be practiced also by someone who has not yet performed Chitta Shuddhi. So it is unique in that Gyan and Yoga, they can lead to experience of Advaya Gyan, or the Absolute, but they cannot be practiced without Chitta Shuddhi. But Bhakti can lead to experience of Advaya Gyan and can be practiced without Chitta Shuddhi. So it goes the lowest, extends the highest, it encapsulates all. And later in Bhagavatam it's also explained how, and even these other processes, inside them is some trace of Bhakti, and that's actually what makes them active and successful. But what Krishna ultimately teaches after explaining all these things that we're talking about now, Jai Shri Guru Gauranga Radha Ki Jai Hari Ju Ki Jai. So in this concluding section where he says, Mon Mana Bhagavat Bhakto, be my devotee, worship me, in other words, practice bhakti, then he means to say that this is the most effective path, which is has the most power, is accessible to someone at any stage, and leads to the highest attainment. But it has this one requisite, that it requires faith. So therefore he can't say it immediately, but once he lays down this foundation and he has Arjuna ready to hear it, then he can say it. So it's classified here as this most hidden or most confidential teaching. And then when Krishna says, Sarva Dharman Parityaja, why is he saying that? One reason he's saying that is that all these other observances of Dharma are necessary for the process of Chitta Shuddhi. But they're redundant now if you actually take up this process of bhakti. So it's not like he's saying reject them arbitrarily or something like that. There's some, you could say, systematic or clear purpose for this rejection, because they no longer have any function, they no longer have any utility in the case of such a devotee, and actually only will obstruct or slow down the process for such a person. But first, right, to say this main verse, then he says, Mon Mana Bhava. So the word Bhava just means be. He's just like, be this, be this, be this, be this, literally. So Mon Mana means one whose mind is given to him, or one whose mind is his, or mine, something like this. So in other words, offer your mind to him, or in other words, think of him always, use your mind in his interest always. Mon Mana Bhava, Vad Bhakta, be my devotee. In other words, engage in bhakti to me. Mod Yaji, Yajan means worship, adoration, offering, and Namaskuru, bow down to me. And one analysis is given that these are ranked by gradation. To be in constant meditation and remembrance of the Lord, not so easy. But to, in general, practice types of devotion, more easy. But even more simply, to make offerings, practical offerings, and even more simple, to bow down. So like some gradation, fully give me your mind, or devote yourself to me fully, or just worship me, or just bow down. Like just somehow, give yourself to me. And then he promises with two words, it's a double statement. He says satyam, which according to one of the commentators, he says satyam, which of course means truth, is also when the word is spoken, it is spoken so as to indicate that one is now making an oath. Like, in English, we say like, I'm going to do this. I'm speaking the truth. I'm going to do it. Like, it's a way of like prefacing that you're making a commitment to this. And then at the same time, pratijani, that word literally means I promise you this, or I declare this. So this is indicative that Arjuna had little hesitation. Because he knows Krishna has not always upheld all his promises. He's been promising the people in Braja he'd be back for a while. So he knew Arjuna had some little hesitation. So he also adds, Priyosime, because you are so dear to me. In other words, I cannot lie, I cannot not keep my promise to someone who is as dear to me as you. So he makes this promise. And then, having made this promise and giving this primary prescription to be his devotee, then the second verse is saying the implication of that. If you do that, if you become my devotee, then what? You can leave everything else. It's redundant, it's unnecessary. It's only will perpetuate some separateness or some distance between us. And then it is reasoned, that someone may hesitate. Well, I thought I needed all this dharma. I thought I needed all these duties and all these practices in order to purify my consciousness. And without those, what will happen to me? Then Krishna is saying, don't worry about that. Mamekam sharanam braja. Just take shelter in me. And aham tham sarva papebhyo. I will liberate you from any sin. So if you fear that by giving up these duties you will transgress dharma, then I will liberate you from that, the effects of that. Or another reading of it is that it's not that Arjuna is afraid that he will get sin, or he will sin because of neglecting these duties, but that he is afraid that he won't get the purification that those activities produce, that he feels or he now thinks that he needs. And also another reading of it is that those duties, the varna, ashram, dharma, all these things, those are things ordered by Bhagavan himself in the Shastra, and to disobey the words of Bhagavan is a sin. So therefore Krishna promises him, don't worry about that, means I'm ordering you to not do it. And this order overrides my previous order. So don't worry about any danger of any sin. There is no danger because you are not transgressing my actual order. A specific order overrides a general order, a later order overrides an earlier order. So don't worry about anything. Don't worry that you won't be purified. Don't worry that you're disobeying my commands, and don't worry that you will engage in any sin. Don't worry about any of it. You are in my shelter, and you can fully, with full confidence of my love and affection for you and my promise to you, you can come. So, such strong words, right? Very strong words. The previous verse for this says, Sarvaguya tamam bhuya shinume paramam bocha. He prefaces the statement by saying, now listen to the most confidential thing I'm going to tell you, which is my supreme statement. Right? So he gives full support to his own statement, and then he says this. So this should be something that naturally gives us a surge of joy and sense of prospect and peace and shelter in our life. That the Lord, with such love, with such intensity of conviction, He has made such a promise, or He has extended such a connection to us. And if we live that in our life, there can be no fear, there can be no worry, there can be no hesitation, there can be no thought of any wrong outcome. If only we can sincerely take up what He has extended to us. So these are, sublime things to be reminded of day by day in our life, and not to underestimate the value of our daily spiritual practice. It might seem something routine, or it might not seem like it has some immediate effect, but really it is the most essential and the most powerful thing we can do in our life. And these words remind us of that and affirm us in continuing that. Okay, we're getting late. I'll stop there. Anyone like to make a comment or ask a question to conclude?
Very good question. So, in light of everything you said about Bhakti's ability to purify consciousness, should be, then in a sense, like all the earlier stuff on Nishkama, Karma Yoga and all, like why do we read all that stuff so much? I mean, when we're doing Gita, why the emphasis on going through Gita, going through all these things, when actually just go to Bhakti and all that is done? And also, practically when we're coming to Krishna consciousness, no one ever teaches us Nishkama, Karma Yoga or any of that stuff. So why the emphasis on the whole Gita rather than just more the Bhakti-centric, core of it?
Well, one reason, we can say there's a couple of reasons. One reason is that if we don't understand the basis, we can't appreciate the higher thing. And it's very common, actually, people come along and say, oh, nice food, nice music, nice temple, nice rituals, like this is chill, I'm down, and they get into the whole act of it, but they really actually don't understand what it's about. They just like the superficial experience of it, and they never actually participate in it, even with the spirit of Nishkam Karma, let alone Bhakti, in terms of the actual spirit of self-surrender. And then they get into that, and then once they're into that, then the typical thing is they want pratishta, they want fame, they want to preach all about it, they get into all of this, and the whole thing becomes hollow. So if people don't have a foundation in the most fundamental principle of what is purifying to the self, and what is actual process of egoless action or the aspiration for egoless action, that principle is so crucial to any healthy spiritual practice that we see Guru Maharaj, so many lectures he comes back to this point, like again and again he starts with this, and I've wondered exactly the same, like why he hammers on this thing, it's automatic in Bhakti, but then at the same time it's not. If we don't really, really get that fundamental thing, it becomes like a hollow construction on top of it. So that's one reason. And another reason is that this principle that we're talking about based on 247, it's in one sense, it's like the idea of self-dedication in a nutshell or in an undeveloped way. So it's, depending on the context in which we talk about it, it's you could say still talking about Bhakti. And there's like some lectures where Guru Maharaj will go straight from that to like Lalita Devi's seva, like that, and
hence it's a continuous, not that it's this Buddhi Yoga being one thing essentially.
So for those two reasons we can say, and Alright, well, shall we chant before it gets too late? Jai Gurudev.
Hare Rama Krishna Rama
Hare Rama Krishna Rama Namo Jai Saparikar Shishi Guru Gauranga Radha Giridhari Ju Ki Jai. Om Vishnu Padre Bhakti Nirmala Charja Maharaj Ki Jai. Chaitanya Saraswata Charja Binda Ki Jai. Om Vishnu Padre Bhakti Sundar Govinda